The United States once nearly wiped out an entire native animal species, the prairie dog. Not because it was a dangerous beast, nor because it truly destroyed crops as people once believed. Prairie dogs are small, underground-dwelling animals, yet for centuries they were labeled with names like pest, destroyer, and biological threat. Today, as drought spreads, land degrades, and grassland ecosystems fall increasingly out of balance, the U.S. is being forced to do something it never imagined, bringing prairie dogs back to the very lands where they were once deliberately eradicated. Why is America doing this? What transformed a species once hunted across an entire continent into one now considered essential? Today, let Terran Works trace the controversial journey of the prairie dog, from a so-called pest to a keystone player in the restoration of North America's grasslands. Before plows tore the soil apart, before barbed wire fences and highways carved the land into pieces, the North American prairie was one of the largest ecosystems on Earth. From Canada down to Mexico, endless seas of grass stretched for thousands of kilometers, sustaining millions of animals both large and small. And at the very heart of that ecosystem stood not the bison, nor the apex predators, but the prairie dog. Scientific estimates suggest that around the year 1800, North America may have been home to more than 5 billion prairie dogs, living in vast underground towns spread beneath the grasslands. Each colony formed a complex maze of burrows, extending across dozens of square kilometers, tightly connecting families and social groups. Prairie dogs did not live in isolation. They built highly organized communities, complete with lookout systems, clear divisions of roles, and even a form of language used to warn one another of danger. Above ground, their presence kept the grass short, tender, and rich in nutrients. Below ground, their constant digging mixed the topsoil, improved water infiltration, and redistributed minerals. For thousands of years, the prairie functioned in balance, with prairie dogs acting as a foundational cog, quiet, often unnoticed, yet impossible to replace. But that order began to unravel when humans arrived. As Europeans pushed westward, prairie dogs were quickly placed on the list of species to be eliminated. On the plains, they were no longer seen as part of the natural order, but as targets to be dealt with. From the late 19th century onward, prairie dogs began to be hunted systematically. At first, it was sporadic gunfire. Later, it evolved into large-scale eradication campaigns. When bullets proved too slow, humans turned to mass poisoning. Poison was poured directly into prairie dog towns, seeping deep into the underground burrow systems and wiping out entire colonies in a short time. By the 20th century, the destruction of prairie dogs was no longer ad hoc, it had become industrial in scale. In South Dakota alone during the 1980s, more than 494,000 acres of prairie dog habitat were poisoned under state orders. Similar campaigns unfolded across the Great Plains, involving both government authorities and private landowners. The result was that by the early 2000s, scientists estimated that 96 to 98% of the original prairie dog population had disappeared, and their habitat had been reduced to roughly 5% of its pre-settlement extent. What is striking is that this decades-long campaign of hunting and poisoning was carried out on the basis of assumptions that were never seriously tested or scientifically verified. One of the most frequently cited justifications for eradicating prairie dogs was the risk of livestock breaking their legs when burrows collapsed. However, long-term studies show that serious injuries caused by prairie dog burrows are extremely rare, far too rare to justify a continent-wide extermination campaign. The second misconception was even more serious. Prairie dogs were labeled as carriers of plague. In reality, since 1949, only 23 out of nearly 500 recorded cases of plague infection in livestock in the United States have had any indirect connection to prairie dogs. More importantly, science has shown that prairie dogs are not disease vectors, but victims. They die in large numbers from fleas that carry the pathogen. In other words, Prairie dogs were not eliminated because they were dangerous, but because humans were afraid. Afraid of something small, numerous, and difficult to control. And when that fear was legitimized through policy, the consequences extended far beyond a single species. Because once prairie dogs disappeared, the prairie itself began to reveal much deeper fractures. The disappearance of prairie dogs did not leave behind a small void. It triggered a cascading collapse. Without a species to keep grasses at an optimal height, many areas were quickly invaded by shrubs such as mesquite. With its deep root systems, mesquite drains groundwater, leaving soils increasingly dry and disrupting the prairie's already fragile balance. As mesquite spread, the grassland gradually lost its open character and shifted toward a semi-desert landscape. Grass cover declined, the soil's ability to retain water weakened, and species that depended on wide, open plains began to disappear or were forced to move elsewhere. This degradation did not happen overnight. It accumulated quietly, year after year. In the state of Chihuahua, Mexico, this process became especially evident. Within just a few decades after prairie dogs were nearly wiped out, vast grasslands that once supported numerous species were transformed into arid landscapes, poor in biodiversity. What is striking is that climate alone was not the driving force behind this change. Even within the same region, areas where prairie dogs still persisted managed to retain their basic ecological structure and function. This contrast raises a critical question. Was it the removal of prairie dogs that stripped the prairie of its ability to recover on its own? When ecologists revisited decades of data, they gradually realized that prairie dogs were not merely crowded residents of the grasslands. In reality, they were silent engineers of the prairie ecosystem. The prairie dog's constant burrowing loosened topsoil, increased water infiltration, reduced erosion, and brought minerals from deeper soil layers up to the surface, key processes that allow grasslands to maintain long-term vitality. Their influence did not stop underground. Prairie dogs also shaped the landscape above the surface. By removing young shoots and shrubs at early stages, they controlled vegetation growth and kept the prairie open, low, and unobstructed. This openness made it easier for prairie dogs to spot predators from a distance, but it also created ideal habitat for many other species that depend on wide, open grasslands. According to numerous scientific estimates, as many as 150 animal species depend directly or indirectly on prairie dogs, from pollinating insects and nesting birds to small mammals and large predators at the top of the food chain. When prairie dogs disappeared, these ecological connections began to fracture. Some species were forced to leave, others declined rapidly, triggering widespread imbalance across the entire ecosystem. Prairie dogs were not the disruptors of the natural order that humans once believed them to be. They were part of that order, one of the forces that kept the prairie functioning in balance for thousands of years. And the moment science came to understand this marked a turning point. From seeking to eliminate prairie dogs, humans began to consider bringing them back as an attempt to reverse a historic ecological mistake. In Arizona, official reintroduction projects for the black-tailed prairie dog began in 2008, coordinated among land management agencies, conservation groups, and private landowners. In the first phase, 78 prairie dogs were relocated from New Mexico and released into southern Arizona, where the species had disappeared since the 1960s. After the trial phase, the program was expanded. Over the following years, roughly 500 prairie dogs were relocated from New Mexico to Arizona through prairie dog relocation programs. Release sites were primarily public lands and protected areas, selected to minimize conflicts with livestock grazing. According to management reports, by the early 2020s, the area was sustaining at least 300 individuals, distributed across approximately 36 acres. Alongside Arizona, New Mexico also launched prairie dog reintroduction efforts within large grassland reserves, not through the sweeping campaigns of the past, but via long-term land management experiments. Prairie dogs were reintroduced gradually, in limited numbers, under close monitoring. Although these programs began on a small scale and amid controversy, they marked a clear shift. For the first time, prairie dogs were being managed as a species in need of restoration, rather than as a target for eradication. It was precisely through long-term monitoring of reintroduction sites that ecologists began to clearly see one of the prairie's most important connections. Most striking was the mutually beneficial relationship between bison and prairie dogs, completely opposite to the long-held assumptions of many ranchers. Bison do not avoid prairie dog towns, they actively seek them out. The reason is simple. Grasses in these areas contain higher levels of protein and nitrogen thanks to constant trimming and the natural fertilizer left behind by prairie dogs. Bison concentrate their grazing in these zones, and the movement of their herds, in turn, compacts the soil just enough to help maintain grassland structure, forming a closed loop of interaction. On the other end of the food chain, prairie dogs are a vital energy source for predators. For coyotes, badgers, and many other carnivores, prairie dogs are a key food that helps them survive harsh winters. These predators then go on to regulate other rodent populations, keeping the ecosystem from drifting out of balance. The connection is so tight that when prairie dog numbers decline, bison grow less robust and predator populations also thin out. These are not isolated relationships, but a network, one in which prairie dogs function as an energy transfer hub for the entire prairie ecosystem. If there is one species that most clearly reflects the fate of the prairie dog, it is the black-footed ferret, one of the rarest mammals in North America. The black-footed ferret lives almost entirely dependent on prairie dogs. Around 90% of its diet consists of prairie dogs, and the burrows dug by prairie dogs also serve as the ferret's homes, shelters, and breeding sites. When prairie dogs were eliminated on a massive scale, black-footed ferrets lost the very foundation of their existence. They lost their food source, their shelter, and their breeding grounds, not because they were directly hunted, but because the entire system that sustained them had been dismantled. The consequences came swiftly and brutally. By the late 20th century, the black-footed ferret was declared extinct in the wild. A species that had once been a familiar link in the North American prairie ecosystem had nearly vanished within just a few decades. Fortunately, a small population was rediscovered in 1981, marking the beginning of a rescue effort. Conservationists came to a clear realization: to save the black-footed ferret, the first and only solution was to restore prairie dog populations. Without prairie dog towns, black-footed ferrets have nowhere to feed, nowhere to hide, and no way to sustain a viable population. The story of the black-footed ferret reveals a simple but harsh truth. In nature, species do not exist in isolation. Removing a species once considered a nuisance can quietly trigger the collapse of the rarest and most vulnerable life forms, and by the time this becomes clear, it is sometimes already too late. Did you know that prairie dogs possess one of the most sophisticated communication systems in the animal kingdom? Through calls that may sound simple to us, they can precisely convey the type of predator, its size, direction of movement, and speed of approach. Based on that information, the colony's response is finely tuned. Some individuals retreat into burrows, others remain above ground to watch, and some may even continue feeding if conditions allow. That rule, however, completely collapses when humans appear. There is no analysis, no selective response. The entire prairie dog colony immediately dives underground in a state of absolute panic. Researchers believe this reaction is not merely an innate instinct, but the result of a collective memory formed over generations. Centuries of hunting, poisoning, and systematic eradication taught prairie dogs a single lesson: humans mean death. What is striking is that this fear does not disappear, even when humans begin reintroducing prairie dogs back into the prairie. Despite closely monitored restoration programs, prairie dogs still respond to people as if they were the greatest possible threat. The story of the prairie dog is not just the story of a small rodent. It is a story about how humans make decisions driven by fear and then pay the price with an entire ecosystem. What do you think about this? How many other species may have been erased simply because humans never truly understood them? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journeys with Terran Works.